Okay, I will start to kick things off. Yeah, well, first of all, thank you to everyone for attending. I think there's going to be a few people filtering in for a little bit longer, but good to get going. I'm Dr. Nick Dodds, part of the team at SatSense. I'm just here to introduce our speaker, who's Tim, but also to convene the Q&A session afterwards. We'll expect to have about 15 to 20 minutes for this. First of all, just to say this session is going to be recorded. So if well, please be aware of that and make sure that your camera is turned off and you're muted aside from in the Q&A if you want to engage in that discussion. Yeah, we'll have about 15 to 20 minutes for that. So yeah, to get started, I'd like to welcome to the floor Professor Tim Wright, who's co-founder and director of SatSense. Tim also wears many hats outside of SatSense. He's a professor of satellite geodesy at the University of Leeds. He's also director of the NERC-funded Centre for Observation and Modelling of Earthquakes, Tectonics and Volcanic Processes, called COMET. He's also the Director of Research and Innovation at Leeds' School of Earth and Environment. His academic work has been at the forefront of developing the use of satellite radar interferometry, so InSAR, for measuring tectonic and volcanic deformation. And in 2018, Tim co-founded SatSense with Professor Andy Hooper in Leeds. Their mission was to make InSAR ground and structure movement data more accessible, accurate and affordable. Up-to-date information derived from InSAR can help to protect the things that matter most to our customers. As such, we have built this capability to continuously update InSAR data, our data sets over wide areas in near real time with each satellite acquisition. Tim also gave a webinar about this time last year to the Pipeline Industries Guild. This will revisit some of that content, but there should be a lot of new content for people who were lucky enough to attend last time as well. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Tim. And yeah, we'll go from here. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Nick. Can everyone hear me all right? I'm assuming yes, and no one said yes. No. Good, thank you. Yeah, as Nick said, it's a great pleasure to be here again, giving another webinar. We would like to kind of focus on some different areas of some of the tools that we're using in SatSense and some of the different targets that might be of interest to you all, hopefully. In particular, we're thinking about looking at assets ranging across the whole spectrum of assets from dams through to end users and individual houses. So, as Nick said, in SatSense, we specialize in wide area processing. So we're continually updating very, very large data sets, whole countries in near real time. So as soon as the satellite comes over, we're updating the data, we're providing an updated time series, new revised surface motion measurements. Those data are very high precision, so we're talking about data with millimetric precision. And increasingly, we're focusing on sort of custom analytics, so trying to turn that raw data into information that can be useful for our customers and our applications. And we have experts in building those tools and also in individual applications. We currently process the whole of the UK and the whole of New Zealand using data from Sentinel-1. We also have targeted data stacks, some in the UK and some elsewhere, using higher resolution satellite data. I'll give at least one example using that later on. We also can work anywhere in the world, so wherever you're interested, we can build data sets, but obviously we don't have those pre-processed. If you're working in the UK, that data is basically available instantaneously. I'll talk a little bit also about some of the work we're doing with corner reflectors, which get over some of the limitations of InSAR in terms of vegetation coverage. So just again to emphasize that, SatSense works across multiple sectors. We operate globally, working with utilities, with transport, with infrastructure, with property, with insurance, geotechnical, geohazards, mining, energy, etc. But anywhere really that ground movement information or indeed other information you can get from satellite radar such as surface flooding. Any information you can get, we can provide. And in the context of this talk, we want to really focus from the kind of upstream end, so looking at monitoring dams and reservoirs through pipelines and distribution networks, but we can also think about safeguarding future infrastructure. So if you're planning a new dam or a new pipeline, it's useful to know how stable the ground is in that individual location, but also in terms of people's homes and how that might be impacted by things such as subsurface tunneling. So very, very briefly, this is a cartoon that's not to scale of how this technology works. So we're talking about using a satellite that's orbiting in a low Earth orbit around, so Sentinel-1's about 600 kilometers above the Earth's surface. It's sending a radar wave down from the satellite to the ground. That wavelength is about a 6 centimeter wavelength. And we measure the energy coming back to the satellite. Now, if the ground moves, that causes a small shift in the wave, and we can measure those small shifts very, very precisely. And we track those through time, and where we can get strong, stable measurements, that can gives us information on the ground movement that occurred and that ground movement history at very high spatial resolution, without the requirement in general for any instruments on the ground at all. There's a lot of jargon in this technology and a lot of things to think about. One of the things that we think about is the different wavelengths of the radar systems that are out there and available. So the workhorse that we use a lot is a system called Sentinel-1. That's at C-band, which is about a 5 centimeter wavelength. When you're talking about that, then you're looking at signals that basically go a little bit into the vegetation canopy, but don't go through that vegetation canopy. If you go to a longer wavelength system, such as L-band, then we can start to see through the leaves and start to interact with either the ground surface or the larger branches. We get much stronger signals there. But these data sets, at the moment, are ones we have to pay for. Sentinel-1 is free. Later, well, in the next few months, we should have the launch of InSAR, which is a US L-band mission, where the data will be free and open. At the other end of the spectrum, if we go to smaller wavelengths, we get less penetration depth, but we get higher spatial resolution from the systems that are currently in orbit. So the systems such as TerraSAR-X and Cosmos SkyMed, and these are really useful for higher resolution infrastructure monitoring. But they're generally suitable for areas with minimal vegetation coverage. But of course, if you're in an area with sparse vegetation, because of the higher spatial resolution, you can look between the trees. Now, this is expensive data, but it can be a suitable tool for some applications. This is an example, in fact, from that higher resolution TerraSAR-X data. This is a dam in Birmingham called the Bartley Reservoir. And what you can see here is a time series. So all of our data is presented like this as individual points on a map. So it's spatial information. In the case of this data, we're talking about a spatial resolution of those dots of, I think this is a 3 meter spatial resolution. Nick can correct me later on. And what you get if you click on any one of those individual points is you also get a time history of their movement. Now, with this high resolution data, we've got data back in this location to 2021. That will vary depending on where you are in the country, what already exists. Some areas have almost no data, some have very long time histories that are available. What we can do is look at those individual time histories, and you can see they're not steady with time. But what we plot generally is the average velocity. So if you look along this particular dam front, you can see there's some movement away from the satellite here. On an average rate over that 3-year period, we're talking about up to about 15 millimeters of movement, so around 5 millimeters per year in these extreme examples. But you can see we're also picking up signals here that are these pink colors, so around that 1 millimeter a year level. So some very subtle movements that we're able to detect, and also changes in those rates of movement. You can think of these a bit like having millions of GPS-like displacement data points. I mentioned earlier about the issue with vegetation and different systems giving you different coverage. What you'll see here is we're getting good signals for this X-band system over where we've got no vegetation or where we've got structures built. So there is some spatial variation there, and that will vary depending on the system. So in this particular case, we're sampling 30 times per year. So how is it useful for monitoring? So we're interested in answering questions such as where and on which asset is movement occurring, what is the magnitude and spatial extent of that movement, and how have the dynamics of that movement changed through time, and how are they changing through time as we go forward. So for example, we might be interested in how is the movement related to the water level in the dam, or if we're thinking about a pipe network, how is that related to seasonal movements that might be caused by rainfall and clays expanding and contracting. So we talked about dam monitoring. This is another dam in the UK that we've been monitoring for a number of years for United Utilities. I think we've been monitoring that for 3 years. This is a clay core construction dam, so you're expecting some movement. That impermeable clay core is obviously designed to stop the water passing through, but it has a semi-permeable shell and it does respond to movement. The interesting thing here is obviously you've got some steady movement, and some of that is expected, but you've also got some non-steady movements and some periods of acceleration. And United Utilities were particularly interested in those and how they might relate to signals that we see. It's worth saying that the signal we see varies depending on where you are on the dam. So we might expect, if there was some kind of slumping of that dam structure, we might expect subsidence at the crest and maybe some translation at the ground and near the base of that dam structure. And depending on which way the satellite's looking, so this gets a little bit technical, but essentially the satellite is traveling in an orbit around the Earth that goes more or less over the poles, and we call the data as it goes north ascending, and the data as it goes south descending. The ascending data for Sentinel looks to the east, and the Sentinel data looks to the west, as you can see here. And we're basically measuring that change in distance between the satellite and the ground. So we can't measure things that are perpendicular to that. But by combining those two geometries, you can get some information about 3D motion, which I'll show you later. There's that figure a little bit bigger, just to show you that geometry and how you might see things differently in different views. This is the ascending data. I think the previous one was the descending data. And what you see in the ascending data is some blue dots here near the base of the dam. And those blue dots have this movement towards the satellite, which we think is largely translational. And again, you can see that's not steady in time. One of the services we offer is an alerting service, whereby if you have a particular asset of interest, we can automatically monitor all of the data points as the new data comes in. We can provide monthly summaries, 6-monthly summaries, whatever really that you need for your particular asset. But we can also send an alert. This particular point has moved more than we expected it to move during the last month or so, and those are tunable parameters depending on how much movement will be of concern to the end user. Just as another example, here's another dam. I'm not sure of the construction type. This is one in Turkey. We have a partnership with a university in Turkey and are trying to expand our coverage there. This is you can see this movement in the dam, particularly near the crest of the dam. And if you make a profile across that, you see that's quite a sort of smooth sag that's going on there with movement towards the center of the dam profile at around 6 millimeters per year on average. And if we look at a time series, again, that's not steady in time. There's a steady component, but you can see there's a little seasonal component. So every year we've got some movement, and then in some, particularly in winter of 2021, there was more movement for this particular dam than there was than the general trend. So again, these are the sorts of information that can be useful. You know, is the dam behaving as you expect it to behave, or is there anomalous movement that you'd be more concerned about? In general, InSAR is a tool that's complementary to existing workflows. So generally, when we're inspecting pieces of infrastructure, we're using instruments on the ground sensors, we're making manual inspections. Those can be expensive. We can only get localized information. They require people, which again are expensive. We might have inconsistent results, and obviously the frequency of that information and that depends on your budget, really. How often can you visit an area, make those new measurements? You also don't get any much wider context in terms of how does that movement, how much of that is reflected by is caused by the wider movement, or are there features that might impact on your reservoir, for example, that aren't the reservoir movement itself, and I'll show you an example of that shortly. InSAR, by contrast, is relatively cost effective. We're getting wide area coverage, and it's a relatively cheap monitoring tool compared to those ground-based approaches. It's completely remote and standardized, so there's no requirement for instruments on the ground. And we get data regularly for every time the satellite goes over. So for the Sentinel system, at the moment, it's every 12 days in an individual geometry, but because for each satellite, and we'll be up to 2 satellites again in the next few weeks, and that will give us, for most of the UK, we'll get 4 images because we're so far north. We get more data, so we get 4 images, and there are 2 satellites every 6 days in different geometries. So it's fairly regular update. And it's a technique that we've validated against ground-based measurements. So this particular one was done in a project with Network Rail, where we were looking at a large landslide that was impacting the railway network. It was a landslide they were monitoring with ground-based techniques, essentially pegs that were hammered into the landslide and then monitored with total stations periodically. And this is an example for an individual peg site. You can see these dots are the measurements made on the ground. And then this is the InSAR time series for the same location. And basically you get the same rate of motion. You also get these little changes here are picked up in the data. There's some high frequency noise in the InSAR, and that largely comes from the atmosphere, and we try and model that away as much as we can, but often there is some unmodeled atmospheric noise that can filter through. But basically we're getting the same information there. And when you compare the displacements we're getting from the pegs with the measurements we're getting from the InSAR, we're getting a very, very good agreement between those two. For any individual date relative to the start of that time series, the agreement is about 8 millimeters. If we're talking about the agreements on the rates of motion, that's even better. Typically, we're talking about an accuracy of about 1 millimeter per year for our rates, where we're getting good reflections from the ground. I mentioned the ability of InSAR to measure information that's happening, things that are happening beyond the boundary fence. So this is a dam. This one is near Harrogate, a reservoir called Skyhouse Reservoir, and you can see, just looking at the image here, that there's this rather unstable looking piece of ground. You can see this landslide there, but of course when you're looking at a static image like this in Google Earth or in some other tool, you have no information about whether that is stable or whether that's actually moving. Here's the InSAR data, so just to get your eye in again, here's the reservoir, here's that landslide here. What you can see in the ascending and the descending data is you've got movement going on there, and I've picked up some individual time histories here. So in the ascending data, which is flying from south to north looking to the east, the movement is away from the satellite. That's a combination of movement that is subsidence and movement that's down the slope here, which is movement away from the satellite. You can see, again, there's some seasonal elements to that, some accelerations, some periods where it goes slower. And you see that very clearly also in the descending data. That's looking to the west in this direction, and the downslope movement here, the horizontal movement, is more towards the satellite, and that's what we're picking up here. Again, you can see some periods where that movement is faster, but also quite some variability in space for that particular location. The dam itself looks pretty stable. Here's another example where we might be thinking more about a pipeline itself and the impact of geohazards such as landslides on pipelines. Again, looking beyond the pipeline itself, the pipe runs here along this cliff edge. Again, you can see these large signals of movement in the ascending and descending. By combining those two, we can actually do better than just sort of arm waving and saying, well, that must be a bit of movement to the east and a bit of movement down. We can do a calculation and take those data sets. I'll just quickly guide you through this. So this orange line here is the real movement that we're of the slope in this particular example. If we're looking in the ascending direction, what you'll measure is this red part of it. So we see the component of that real motion that it is along the direction we're looking. And that's movement away from the satellite in that particular geometry. If we're looking at the descending pass, what you see then again is the component of that real motion that is movement towards the satellite. So a much smaller signal, but in this case it's movement towards the satellite, that blue vector there. So we'd have that information, and what you can do is a transformation that allows you to, with some assumptions, say something about the amount of vertical and the amount of horizontal motion that you would have. One of the limitations is we only have two observing geometries. Motion is in 3 dimensions, so typically you have to make an assumption. So in a landslide, you might say the landslide is moving down the slope or in the direction, the horizontal movement is in the direction of the slope, or it might be in some cases you can say that we don't expect much north-south motion. Going back to that example I showed you earlier of this landslide moving here, this is movement is in an east-west direction, so we can say the horizontal movement is east-west. We can solve for the magnitude of east-west motion here on this somewhat coarser grid and the amount of vertical motion here. And then we can look at things like time series of that horizontal motion. And here the nice thing is we've done is compared that to the rainfall. You can see in 2023 there was more rainfall than normal. We can see there's been this very large signal and there's a large amount of movement in response to that. And there was a landslide, a catastrophic failure in November 2023, which then impacted the pipeline. So you can see that break in the time series. So probably these are incorrect measurements after November 2023. But a very nice case study here of the value of the data. And I think in particular, when you can get the data, you can start to understand what's causing the movement, and then you might then be able to be on more alert when you've got larger rainfall events. You can see what kinds of signals you might expect to see. Moving to an example from New Zealand in terms of critical pipeline monitoring. This is geothermal pipelines in this particular case. We're in the Taupo volcanic zone, a very volcanically active area, very beautiful area for anyone who's been there. This is just a little bit south of Rotorua. The Rotorua is here, and we're talking about the Wairakei geothermal field just next to Lake Taupo. Very beautiful areas. I can say from personal experience, there's a very lovely geothermal swimming pool in Taupo, so I recommend that anyone is visiting. Clearly that geothermal extraction also causes ground movement. And here's some ground movement data for that pipeline. So this is the critical pipeline running along this location, and some very large movements here. So we're talking about movements in these darker red colours, more than 4 centimetres per year. If we actually just quantify that on a graph, here's the movement along the pipe, and you can see that movement up to just over 40 millimeters per year. The key thing here actually is that the overall movement doesn't really affect the pipe. If the whole pipe is moving up and down, that's not really going to impact the pipe. What matters is if there's bending or strain on the pipe. So what you can do is take this data and actually calculate the strain on the pipe. And this is the strain rate here then mapped back onto that pipeline. And you can see there's a particular location here with much higher strain rates. So these will be the places where you might want to think about putting remediation in there. So maybe you want to build your pipe to allow for that movement. When we're looking at the UK, one of the works, I talked a lot more about this last year in last year's webinar, and I'm sure you can catch up on that on the website as well. But we've been working in a project called DRIPIN with the European Space Agency and a number of partners on actually trying to look at risks of pipe networks in the UK. And what we can do is take the ground movement data and try and extract things like the amount of strain, the amount of seasonal movement, etc. And find a whole bunch of different risk indices. Is there acceleration? What kind of wavelength of movement are we seeing? And what we've been doing is trying to use that with partners listed here to try and test how much improvement we can make in terms of people's failure models. So just a small amount more detail here. We take the historical InSAR ground movement data. We can take the pipe network, some information on historical pipe bursts. We're training then machine learning models to try and detect spatial and temporal patterns that correlate to past bursts. And we're aiming to build a sort of operational machine learning model to help predict the likelihood of failure. And basically the output here is an annual ranking of at-risk pipes that can help inform strategic inspection and maintenance. And the preliminary results we were getting were around maybe a 30–40% improvement. Still a lot of ongoing work. I think one of the big challenges in this project is a lot of pipes fail for other reasons that are not ground movement. So maybe that's ice, pipes freeze and burst. You wouldn't necessarily expect to see long-term ground movement or ground movement signatures from that. But when we're getting data to train the models, it often doesn't differentiate the causes of the pipe burst. So that's the problem we're working with at the moment. Can we try and work out which kinds of pipe bursts we're good at predicting, which ones we're not? Can we further train our models so it really pulls out those particular bursts? And I think in particular we think those kind of summer bursts that are peaking in summer bursts you get in the hot periods, again due to clay expanding and contracting, ought to be things that the data are quite well tuned to picking up. Just thinking about future infrastructure, if we're building new pipelines, burying new pipelines or on the surface, then actually understanding the ground movement that is ongoing in those areas before we build the pipes is really important. So are we building our pipeline through a landslide that's going to cause us problems, or is it a nice area of stable ground? There's a lot of future instrumentation going underground, and of course that tunneling also then has an impact on the ground surface as well. So here's a nice example from some recent work we've done in London. This is some power line tunnels that have been going on. You can see very clearly in the average velocity that these are the movement of the buildings above the tunnel, exactly where that tunnel has gone. And again, you can see the time histories here. So basically, you can see when the ground dropped. Mid-2023 was when that tunnel boring machine would have gone past, and there's been some ongoing movement since then. So it's really, again, a powerful tool for monitoring the impact of any pipe construction work. Again, just to remind you that we don't get perfect coverage everywhere. So this data here is, I believe this is the high resolution data with very little data in vegetated areas. Some of the other data sets we've shown, for example, I'm going to go back to that landslide here. So we can get some coverage. This is from C-band Sentinel-1 data. We get sparse coverage in areas of natural vegetation. So generally, the more rocks there are, the better coverage we get. One of the ways to overcome that, if we have a particular area we're interested in and yet it's vegetated, is we can install corner reflectors. These are artificial reflectors. The idea here is that the energy from the satellite comes in, hits the corner reflector, it bounces off the three surfaces and pings straight back in the direction it came from. A little bit like hitting a snooker ball into a corner of a snooker table. You get the ball comes back in the same direction that you hit it in. And that gives you a very, very precise, very bright point in your image that then means that that's the signal we're monitoring rather than the clutter we get from the vegetation in the background. We've done some trial work again with Network Rail on this. This is an example of a pipeline, a railway network near Whitstable, showing, and that's an area where they knew there was some ground movement. And again, you can track that movement of those corner reflectors through time. So I think that was my last slide. The summary really is, with this technology, we've got a technology that can remotely monitor movement. We can go back in time. So with Sentinel-1, we can go back to 2015. With some of the other sensors, it does depend on where you're looking, and we can look into that for you. We can obviously monitor into the future and continuously update that data in real time over very wide areas. So in places like UK and New Zealand, we have data pre-processed at the moderate Sentinel-1 resolution, and for some parts also with a higher resolution data. So I'm going to leave it there, and the contact details are here, but I'm happy to spend the rest of the hour answering questions, any questions that you have. So speak to you soon. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tim. Yeah, we should have a good sort of 15-20 minutes to answer any questions. If attendees have questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments, and well, yeah, Tim will do his best.
I'll pass them over to you if I can answer them next.
Yeah, we can wait for those to filter in soon.
Okay, yeah, what format can we supply the data in? Yeah, so we're really flexible actually about the format that you can get the data in. It's a great question. And it depends what you want. So that data can be provided in an interactive data portal that we host. It can be provided via an API plugin that you can then input into your own systems. We can give you a shape file that can be viewed in a GIS system like QGIS, and we have plugins that help you interact with the data. Or we can give you a big CSV file with all the data in, if that's what you want. So it really depends. We're extremely flexible, and one of the things we kind of pride ourselves in is trying to work out what's most useful for you and tuning a delivery method that will be appropriate for your needs. Yeah, great question again from Tony's asked there. Could a portfolio of reservoirs be looked at, and would this be more efficient? Absolutely, yeah. I mean, for somewhere like the UK, I think the analysis is fairly automated, so we can easily expand to a portfolio of reservoirs. If we're looking at getting the higher resolution data, that has a footprint that is typically about 60 kilometers square. Nick, is that right? Ish, 30 kilometers square. So it depends on the kind of exact data that we want. So obviously, if you have reservoirs close together and you wanted the high resolution data, there'd be some efficiencies there, because that data we have to pay for typically. But Nick, I'm sure Nick's more on the commercial side of things, and would probably be able to offer you a portfolio deal, I'm sure, as well.
Yeah, to be honest, in the UK, I think it's worth reinforcing that we process and keep the UK up to date in real time. So for any assets in the UK, the data is there to use and be used. So in that sense, yeah, effectively, we would be monitoring a portfolio of assets in the UK already. It's just, yeah, telling us that you want them to be monitored, or not monitored, telling us that you want the data.
And I do think
that approach can be taken as well.
Sorry, carry on, Nick. I talked over you.
No, I was going to say, so obviously we do that in the UK, but and New Zealand in terms of continuing updating, but we can do that anywhere in the world as well. So depends where we're looking.
I do think there's a, you know, if the data is there, it's not that expensive as an additional monitoring tool. It has, for the Sentinel data, some dams work really well, some work less well, but we can give you that information if you make a request as well. So give us your portfolio, we can do an assessment of where we get good data, where we don't, and then there'll be a discussion with Nick probably about the price for that. But I think, yeah, reasonably cost effective, I think, as a tool. Also, it's pretty hands off, right? So it's you provide that data, it can give you, one of the things it can do, I think, is give you some reassurance for if you're, for example, doing manual visits once a year, for example, to your reservoirs just to check nothing's changed. Then it gives you that reassurance in the period between those manual visits that nothing dramatic has changed. So I think it's a good cost-effective tool in that regard.
I can ask one now, Tim. So with the advent of open source L-band hopefully about to start, how do you see sort of the applications and capability for interested parties of the Pipeline Guild? How do you see that changing versus what you already have?
Yeah, the big change will be the increase in coverage. So the longer wavelength data, and so NISAR I think is currently scheduled for launch in Q1 next year. We're in that period where, you know, that will probably slip a bit more, but the time gap to that launch is definitely getting smaller, which is great. Most of the UK should be nicely coherent. We should get good measurements over a lot of the typical kind of dam structures or pipeline networks that we get in the UK. It will still have problems over, for example, agricultural fields that get ploughed. There might be still some problems, but the big change will be it will be dramatically improved compared to Sentinel-1. It's very similar spatial resolution, so it will be a really nice system. It will take a little while, so we'll start getting data pretty quickly, I think, next year, and then obviously we'll need to build up a time series, so the kind of active monitoring can start straight away. We can get active monitoring with L-band straight away, but actually to get that sort of longer term movement, you know, we might be talking a year to build up a data stack. So before we can start to give you a sort of reliable millimeter per year kind of average rates, but the monitoring for large movements can happen straight away. Have you got anything to add to that, Nick?
No, I was asking you. Yeah. Any more questions from anyone in the attendees? Yeah, don't be shy.
Corner reflectors. Yeah, so Paul asks how many corner reflectors are needed to cover an area of say 1 square kilometre, and how big they are. So the corner reflectors are about a metre on the side into the dimensions, so they're fairly substantial. We have a sort of system that's been designed with a partner company to help kind of screw those into the ground. A very secure system. You can also mount them on if you've got some piece of infrastructure, concrete or whatever, you can actually just simply screw them in. I think the number of reflectors you need depends on what you're trying to monitor. I think it's not a simple rule. So we saw some examples in my talk there where on certain dams you've got quite localized movement if you're moving along the crest of the dam, and some others where it's much smoother in space. So I think it would depend on what you're trying to look at. Really, it's about guaranteeing a measurement at the point you put in that reflector. So I think that's the answer. It's not a very precise answer, but it's something we work with you to try and optimize that number. Yeah, each one costs. So, Nick, have you got a price for the corner reflectors? It probably depends again on scale and how many you order.
Yeah, it depends on about the number of them that you need, but rule of thumb, we say about £1,000 per reflector is a good place to start.
Yeah, and obviously you might have some installation costs on top of that, depending on where they're going. Yeah. Okay.
See if anyone else has anything they want to ask. Well, in which case, Tim, well, thank you very much for giving your talk. And yeah, if anyone wants to get in touch directly with SatSense, feel free to use either the contact@satsense.com or get in touch with either Tim or myself directly, and we can go from there. I think we had a question above about the slides. The video will be published after this session by the Pipeline Guild, I believe, and we can look to provide the slides to attendees. SatSense don't have your contact details, so they will be coming via the guild as well. Louis, I can yeah, we're pretty transparent about our rates, so I can get in touch directly about those if that's easiest. In which case, yeah, thanks very much for all of you for attending, and yeah, we'll look forward to hopefully catching up with some of you either virtually or in person going forwards. And yeah, thanks again to Tim.
Great, thanks Nick, thanks everybody. Bye.
Thank you.